Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and talk about chapter 26 and continue our discussion about the British and European role in the world around them. We talked about slavery being something that had caused an abolition movement. The people wanted to rise up and bring it to an end because of the horrors of slavery. We had said that as Europeans began to realize that the Haitian Revolution had inspired a lot of people to rebel, to seek freedom, and Christians had said, look, this is wrong, that we treat people this way. The abolition movement grew incredibly. We also said people like William Wilberforce, which is a person you should know by name, was an evangelical, these new Christians that said that Christianity and slavery don't match up, and they try to do everything they could to bring it to an end. People like John Newton also used their skills as songwriters to bring the institution of slavery to an end as well. We also said that the British freed over 100,000 people. They sent them to Freetown in Sierra Leone. We also said that there was challenges as the British found, or as Africans tried to find other ways to replace their income from slave money by harvesting palm oil, which we said is really problematic. Palm oil, we said, leads to deforestation even to this day, and so it's a problem in 2015 because people clear, rainforests in order to go ahead and have these palm plantations that don't have the diversity that you would need for sustaining these complex biomes. Now we're going to talk about on the very bottom of page 1 about American involvement in Africa, and it has to do with this nation's flag, which looks a lot like the United States flag, and that's for a reason. On the handout, by 1821, a nation was set up by Americans. What had happened is that this was Liberia was a nation set up as an alternative to giving blacks freedom, was the idea of resettling them in a free country in West Africa. There was a lot of abolitionists that were freeing blacks in America, and they said, you know what, we do want to free blacks in America, but we don't think that a free black person in America would be very comfortable or very safe. So instead what they decided to do is they said, wouldn't it be better if we sent them on a boat back to Africa as liberated men and women? And because they were going back to Africa as liberated men and women, it was called Liberia. In fact, on the handout, Liberia would become one of the few African countries not to become colonies in the 18th or 19th century. And so basically this is a free nation called Liberia that the United States basically said, we promise we'll protect you, we'll promise we'll watch out for you. And other European countries generally don't look to colonize Liberia because they know the United States is backing up Liberia. And to honor the role of American involvement, the capital city of Liberia is called Monrovia after President Monroe. The bummer about this whole story is that the African American former slaves that come to Liberia, and they actually take over from the local Africans, and they actually push the native Africans down, and the African Americans become the ruling class. So even though it's like a good thing in one way, another way it's really bad how the African Americans became the ruling class and subjugated the local African people. Okay, let's now talk about the Swahili Coast. This is on the back side of page 2. It says, slavers' response to the British was to move to the southern and eastern coasts away from British influence. So they said, look, okay, we know the British are patrolling, the British are using their ships to stop slavery, let's just move away from the British. And one area they moved to was in this orange, which is called the Swahili Coast. And it's called the Swahili Coast because guess what they spoke? They spoke Swahili. So they're still practicing slavery, and what are they doing with the slaves that they do practice now that the British aren't available to stop them here? 2/3 of these slaves, 1.2 million, enter into African slavery. They enter into African slavery. In other words, Africans sold them to other Africans. Mainly these would be Muslims in North Africa, because you might remember the Quran and the Hadith don't have any clear prohibition of slavery. So remember, Muslims used slaves for things Europeans never did, like soldiers, like eunuchs, and like concubines. And so that would be where they went. And another 1/3 were still sent to the Atlantic slave trade. Still 1/3 sent to the Atlantic slave trade. Europeans continued to buy them even though the British tried to stop it. And let's talk about this group in orange. This is a group of Arab and Swahili speakers. You might remember that Swahili is the language spoken in Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda today. And you might remember that Swahili is a mix of Arabic and Bantu, which is a native African language. On the handout, these Arab and Swahili speakers in this orange part of the map, They use hundreds of thousands of slaves in the new ivory trade. And so they're also using slaves not for palm, but in this part of the country where there's elephants and where there's rhino horns, they use it for the ivory trade. Today, ivory trade and rhino horn is still a big deal and sent mainly to China, where they grind it into a powder, and Chinese people believe that it has medicinal value. And why are these people in orange able to enslave people and use them into the slave trade? Well, the advantage they had is they had primitive guns, and they were able to use these primitive guns to beat up other Africans and make them be slaves. And who was the supplier of these primitive guns on the handout? The Europeans did. The Europeans gave these Swahili Arabic speakers guns. These are not like the best guns, but better than what other people might have had, and they used these guns to their advantage. And why did the Europeans do this? Well, because who is also consuming these African luxury products? Who is getting the ivory back in the 1800s? Well, the consumers of African goods were also Europeans. So the Europeans were the suppliers of guns, and the consumers were also Europeans of these African luxury products. And so who are the people who are propping up these slave owners in East Africa? It's really just the Europeans. If the Europeans didn't give them guns, if the Europeans didn't buy their stuff, these people would not be able to have slaves. These people would not be able to be in charge or rule, and that's why we call them secondary empires, because of their dependency on Europe. They depended on Europe. All right, let's talk about India. You might remember India was one of the 3 Muslim empires in the world. There was the Ottoman Empire that was mainly Sunni. There was the Safavid Empire, which was mainly Shia. And then there was the Mughal Empire, which was different because it was a it was a Muslim minority ruling a Hindu majority. And remember, Europeans have been interested in India for a long time. This is why Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. We want to get to India, was what the Europeans were saying. Now, the first ones to get there were the Portuguese, and you might remember the Portuguese didn't have any quality products. The Indians basically laughed at the Portuguese for showing up. But the Portuguese, even if they didn't have good products, they did have something really cool, which was a powerful navy. So on the handout, the role of the Portuguese in the 1600s, they used the use of navy as an intimidating force. You might remember there was also the Dutch East India Company. Remember that the first people to India were not necessarily like armies, invading armies, but they were like companies and corporations. But all this was just really indirect rule. It was indirect rule. You might remember India was just way too big and way too populated for Europe to take over. We don't see any direct rule in the 1600s, no direct rule in the 1700s. There's no disease that will wipe out the Indians in India like the Native Americans would be wiped out. So they just really can't. And on the handout, but even though they couldn't in the 16 and 1700s, times are changing in the 1800s. On the handout, it says the British power was on the rise. British power was on the rise, especially in light of the British defeat of Napoleon's forces. Remember that it used to be like France and Britain were like the 2 most important countries in the world. France and Britain would fight and fight and fight. Well, the British had defeated France and Napoleon recently, and now the British are like number 1, like the most important country in the world. Now we see an era of the British moving away from a mercantilist, slave-centered colonies. Slave-centered colonies. And let's talk about that word mercantilist or mercantilism real quick. Remember we talked about triangular trade or the Atlantic Circuit. Mercantilism is where you have colonies that send you raw materials and you also like force them to buy your stuff. Well, the British had done that for a long time, but guess what happened? They couldn't do that anymore because what the 13 colonies did was get their freedom. The 13 colonies got their independence. The 13 colonies got their ability to become their own nation. So how can you have mercantilism when a huge piece of the puzzle's gone? The British really want to replace America, so they have to move away from that. On the handout, they move away from a mercantilist, slave-centered colonies in the Americas. Slave-centered colonies in the Americas, moving away from that to a free trade, semi-free colonies in the East. Semi-free. What I mean by semi or semi-free is that India at first was still just too big for the British to rule directly. They're going to try to work with local people to take over. And that's exactly what the British want to do. They want to make relationships with upper class people. They want to cut deals. They want to say, hey, we'll keep you in, kind of like local power if you just follow our lead, if you promise to be subservient to us. Semi-free colonies in the East. The end of the Mughal. Well, on the handout, the Mughal used to be the Muslim Indian Empire. You might remember there was the Muslim Indian Empire. It had been founded by Babur. He was the man who started the Mughal Empire. And it was mixed by Akbar. Akbar, we've talked about him before. Remember how he mixed like Hindu and Muslim and Christian beliefs, and briefly he had like his own religion, and he said he was God, and it was kind of weird and it didn't last. But the decline of the Mughal, as the Mughals decline, it opens the way for Europeans. With the Mughals becoming less powerful, it opens the way for Europeans to come into this subcontinent. The thing about moving to India, it's scary for Europeans to go to a place they've never been. It's scary for them to move to a place where there's different languages and cultures. And so there's a word for these earliest white people to come in. They work for companies like the Dutch East India Company. They work for companies like the British East India Company. And because they work for these corporations, guess what they're called? They're called company men. These were the first Europeans on the handout where it says company men, the first Europeans who would come to India. The first ones to come to India in order to persuade Indian rulers to establish trading posts. That's who these company men were. They wanted to work with the Indians and to convince them to allow them in. Now, living here in India can be dangerous, and so the British want to hire locals who will fight to be kind of like bodyguards or like private soldiers. And the word for these bodyguards or private soldiers are called sepoys. And so the handout is sepoys. In order to protect themselves from other Europeans, they hired Indian troops. They hired Indian troops known as sepoys. These are essentially private armies. Well, the British are going to eventually, whenever you have one group of people moving into another, there's going to be conflict and fighting, and there's going to be a famous battle that is going to show the power of the British to start beating up and taking over India. And that battle is led by a white British soldier named Robert Clive at the place called the Battle of Plassey. This was the most pivotal of these leaders, was this British man named Robert Clive at the Battle of Plassey. And this is where on the handout you'll write down there were 3,000 British troops. 3,000 British troops defeated an Indian army. They defeated an Indian army of 50,000 Indian troops. So there was 3,000 British soldiers against 50,000 Indians. It doesn't matter. The Indians have way bigger soldiers, much more troops. The British have something the Indians don't. They have guns. The best guns in the world. And so those guns in the world will allow a small white European army of 3,000 to destroy an Indian army of 50,000. And this results on the handout in a British victory over this territory. So they're able to take it over little by little by little. Next section is Raj and Rebellion. Raj, that word basically means like India ruled by the British. And so when we talk about the Raj, R-A-J, we're talking about British ruled India. So challenges to company rule. Once the company on the handout got to informally rule India, this corporation was informally ruling India. So this company is there and they're kind of like calling the shots, but not like the company owns India, but practically this company is in charge of India. They were ruling over a population larger than that in all of Western Europe. So this English corporation that is in India, they find themselves controlling a population that's bigger than all of Europe together. And that's going to be really a challenge. And so they can't offend all these hundreds of millions of people. So they realize that there's some things they can't change, some things that they can't undo about this culture. And so it says pragmatic toleration. They had to show toleration for native religious beliefs and local customs. They had to show toleration. They couldn't just start calling the shots and telling them what they can and can't do. Now on the handout, it says on the very bottom, it says, benefits to empire. Are there any good things about the British taking over? There are. Page 3 on the top, it says infrastructure. The British pushed millions into rail, canals, roads, telegraph wire. The British do build these things. Now, they don't build them because they just want to be super kind to the Indians. They build it because they want stuff from India, and it's easier to get crops and products and raw materials out of India if there's roads and bridges and canals, and you can have quick communication with the army if you have telegraphs. But you could also get jobs, though. In fact, on the handout, there was jobs as sepoys. If you were Indian, you could get a job working in the British Army. In fact, on the handout, it shows you that the sepoys had about 200,000 jobs, so that's pretty good. In fact, they paid you better in the British Army as a sepoy than you would get if you had been in the Indian Army. And some practical benefits. By 1870, India had the largest Asian rail network. There was no country in Asia that had a larger rail network, so they had the largest Asian rail network in the world. In fact, it ranked on the handout 5th on the planet. It was like the 5th most extensive rail network on the planet, which is cool. That meant that India had a better rail system than a lot of white European nations. Like, I don't know the numbers, but I can almost guarantee they had a better rail network than Spain and Portugal that had kind of peaked in the 1600s. Their rail was so incredible. They had 18 million passengers a year use it. And so they put a huge, huge impact on rail. One of the bummers about rail and all these millions of people moving to north, south, east, west is it did help where it says negative impact spread of disease. So that's not good. One way that disease was limited by the British, though, was they built some of the first modern sewage systems in 1865, which did limit certain diseases from spreading. Having a good sewage system helped some diseases from spread. So that was a good thing. Agriculture. The British do some things that you might say are questionable in agriculture. They transform the agriculture to export only crops like coffee, opium, silk, tea, sugar, cotton. The British said, hey, we're in charge now. You're just going to grow these things. These are the things we want. We want coffee. We want opium. By the way, opium is a highly addictive drug. We'll talk about why they want opium later. It's not really for themselves, but we'll mention that later. They want silk, tea. They are highly addicted to tea. They say, this is all we want. And they just want raw cotton. They don't want the Indians to be making clothes. They don't want them to be making textiles. They say, we just want cotton. And the downsides is this pushed out local textile producers, because the British say, we don't want you Indians to make the cotton. We don't want you to make anything out of the cotton. We just want it raw. But this pushed all the local people in India that used to make high quality clothes out of business. Other changes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this agricultural element in a minute. So it pushed out local textile producers, and where it says schools, 24,000 British schools were opened. English spread. And now, again, have we ever talked about Europe taking over an Asian nation? And the answer is no. Just like Europeans were taking over Africa, now Europeans are taking over Asia. And when you take it over, you spread your language as well. You spread your culture as well. This is the first time Asia is being taken over, just like Africa. Well, not everyone's going to like this. And parts of India are actually going to rebel. In fact, all these areas are going to show you the states that were in rebellion. Not all of them rebelled. A lot of them did rebel. Some of them, it says, were neutral. Some in blue aided the British in putting down this rebellion. Some in green were neutral. Those in blue and dark blue, the dark blue were in rebellion. And so just a lot of different things going on. And it's not like one clear thing going on in India. A lot of different groups taking a lot of different positions. Well, why did they rebel? Well, I mean, you can guess. They rebel for the same reason that the 13 colonies do. The 13 colonies don't want the British telling you what to do. They don't want your freedom taken away. And a lot of Indians didn't want that either. But there's a lot of different reasons they rebel. One had to do with cultural insensitivity. In 1857, pig and beef fat caused them to want to rebel. Pig and beef fat. basically, without getting into a lot of detail, the British had hired these sepoys, and they had to use these guns, and to like open up like their ammunition cartridge, it was real common that you would use your teeth to open up these packages that you would use to reload your gun. The problem with these packages that you use your teeth to like open up, they were covered in either beef or pork fat. Well, the beef fat really upset the Indians who were Hindu, because you might remember, like, beef, the cow is a sacred animal, and the pig fat upset sepoys that were Muslims, because you might remember that pigs are prohibited animals from eating. The British thought, oh, it's no big deal, just open it with your mouth, whatever. And this is cultural insensitivity made the sepoys say, hey, wait a second, we're fighting for you, but you were doing these things that are like against our religion. Another second reason why the sepoys were upset was they were forced to deploy, where it says deployment, they were forced into deployment to foreign countries. They're forced to deploy in foreign countries. In other words, they had to go fight not in India, but the British would want to take the Indians and say, hey, I know that you signed up just to fight in India, but we kind of need you, so we're going to send you somewhere else. And a lot of the sepoys were like, listen, I didn't sign up for doing that. I didn't sign up to leave India. You can't just send me where you want. So they were upset about that. Some Indians were upset about the outline of the sati. That word sati is S-A-T-I. You might remember this was the custom of a woman throwing her body on the body of her burning husband after he had died. That was a way of showing loyalty and respect. The British looked at this and said, we're not going to do the whole throw your body on your husband's burning body thing anymore. They prohibited that. And the British are kind of like in that mood right now, with evangelicals kind of inspiring British culture. Remember, evangelicals said, I don't care if you think slavery is okay, we're going to stop slavery wherever we find it. And in the same way, these evangelicals are saying, we don't care if you think sati is okay, we're going to outlaw it. Speaking of outlawing, the British also, where it says marriage, they began outlawing child brides. You might remember in India that there was a lot of child marriages where you might have like a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old married to a grown man. The British say, no, we're not going to allow that anymore. And Indian civil service will right now hired almost no Indians. The Indian civil service hired almost no Indians. What is the Indian civil service? Well, the Indian civil service was basically like the bureaucracy. It was the group that was responsible for administering the empire. And you would think that like the Brahmins or the upper class would be like the natural candidates to, be government workers, but the Europeans did not allow them to. The Europeans didn't want them to do any of that. And so almost no one got a job in the bureaucracy, and they thought that was incredibly wrong, and they thought that that was, just something that was upsetting and causing problems. So almost no one was hired, and they would bring these Indian civil servant workers in from foreign nations. Next line, ultimately, on the handout, it says, ultimately, this rebellion failed, and it led to the deaths of and executions of thousands. Here we have an image of these sepoys, and here with the sepoys you can see that the sepoys are depicted as being, this rebellious mob here on the bottom, and you can see that the British Empire is showing her strength and able to do these sorts of things with the shield. And right here you see a scale. In the British view, this was just an act of justice to do this, an act of justice, that they believed that it was a good thing that they do this. It was a good thing that they go ahead and put down this rebellion, and that it was something that they deserve. Here, in fact, we also see another cartoon at the time depicting the British Empire as like this victorious lion, India as a tiger, even attacking an innocent woman. So this rebellion of India is not a good thing, but it's a bad thing. And for the British to come in, it's just like, oh, it just makes sense for us to take over like that. And unfortunately, the sepoys were executed. They were put on front of cannons, and they would use cannons to blow up the sepoys' bodies. Horrible things. Ultimately, this was a failure for the sepoys. This rebellion did not work, and the British goals for India, well, they want to make it Western, they want to make it English-speaking, they want to modernize it, that's what they want. And they continue to push this agenda on the handout where it says economic changes, production of opium, we'll talk more about this real soon, for export to China, That was one of the things they pushed. They destroyed the local textile industry and they moved to raw Indian cotton. Why do they want just raw Indian cotton? Well, it was cheaper. Why Europeans wanted it? Well, it was cheaper because of the Industrial Revolution. What's better to have like some Indian person working 24/7 like making textiles, or is it better to have a machine running 24/7 in Europe cranking it out because of the Industrial Revolution? Because of images like this, we see the start of the Indian independence movement, Indian nationalism. People begin to become really proud of being Indian, and they start looking for opportunities to think about rebellion. On the handout it says India and reform. Now, after this rebellion, the British say it's better if we just like full-on take over directly, so it moves from company rule to direct rule. In fact, here we have the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, and she actually becomes called the Empress of India in 1877. So she full-on claims direct rule of India. She claims to be the Empress of India. And an attempt to solidify British rule, they do want to try to give some sort of benefits, and so they claim that there's equal protection of law, or they say it doesn't matter if you're Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist, whatever you are in India, you have equal protection of law, and they grant freedom of religion as long as it's not something that upsets the British, like sati or child marriage. One of the big problems is this whole Indian civil service issue. Remember, these are like basically the bureaucracy. These are like the sweet government jobs that you want to have. But the problem is like the British were not hiring any Indians to work these jobs. And the Indians were like, that doesn't make any sense. We speak the language. We're from here. We're really well-educated Brahmins. Why can't we work there? Well, one of the reasons was just racism. The average Indian civil servant was managers of the empire that were trained at Oxford or Cambridge, and there was only one Indian by 1870. You have like a country of over 100 million, and you only hire one Indian man in India? That's just racism. In fact, the quote below shows that. Here, one British official says, however clever a native may be, I believe that no rank we can bestow on him would cause him to be considered an equal of the British officer. So it doesn't matter how smart these brown people think they might be. The British thought, because of racist reasons, they could never be as good as a white man. The Indian elite on the handout, what is their view? The growing importance to educate the existing upper class of Indians. To educate the existing upper class of Indians. The idea is of partnering with them to extend legitimacy to the British presence. Extend legitimacy. So the British were saying to some of the upper class, hey, we won't hire you, but we'll make you deals. You know, we'll educate you, we'll give you benefits. As long as you tell people, hey, it's cool to be run by the British, we're going to give you some benefits, even if we're not going to like necessarily hire you. And so they were giving like Western style education to the Brahmins, the upper class who were learning English, starting to dress like the British, etc. We see the import of Western language schools. And now, this is a real dangerous thing, educating people, because now that upper-class Indians are like learning English and reading about English history, they're learning about things like constitutionalism. They're learning things about the English Bill of Rights. They're learning about social contract. And they're like, wait a second, we're being taught all this stuff, but we're not getting any of this stuff. What's the deal? So once you start educating, it's like a very dangerous thing to do. On the handout, a group of well-educated Indians who get together to talk is the Indian National Congress. These were Western-educated elites, and they are Western-educated. They've learned about British language and culture and history, but because they're upper class, no like local people really follows them. So let's now move and talk about South Africa. Here's South Africa. White Europeans have been settling there for a long time. The first people to South Africa that were white were the Dutch, who settled there. On the handout where it says British South Africa, we're on the top of page 4. Napoleon has something to do with this, which seems like Napoleon has a lot to do with a lot of things in world history. Napoleon, on the handout where it says the Napoleonic Wars, had resulted in the conquest of the Netherlands. In other words, Napoleon had taken over the Netherlands. Remember, he took over like a lot of Europe in the early 18th century. And Dutch leaders, well, they didn't want Napoleon to like have their colonies. And so like the Dutch realized, look, Napoleon's going to take us over. Before he takes us over, and before he can and if he takes us over, he gets all the stuff we own. We don't want him to have Africa. So they said all this in green, which is owned by the Dutch, they tell the British, we're just going to give it to you. We'd rather you have it than Napoleon have it. And so they okay the British takeover of this overseas possession as an attempt to reduce Napoleon's power, influence, and reach overseas. So they'd give it to the British. Cape Colony. This included the British takeover of the South African colony, of Cape Colony. And this was seen as a crucial link between Britain and its Asian colonies. Remember that this is a halfway point between England and India. We want to get to India, so hey, if we own Cape Colony, it's right in the middle, and that'll be super awesome. The big problem, there's white people who live there already. They've been living there for like over 100 years, called the Afrikaners. The reason they're called the Afrikaners is these men, these women were born in Africa. Their dads were born in Africa. Grandma was born in Africa. And so if you've been living in Africa for your entire life and your dad's entire life and grandpa's entire life, you're going to say you're African. On the handout, the Afrikaners, the problem here was that it had been populated with white European settlers of Dutch and French descent for hundreds of years. These people now began to view themselves as African. They viewed themselves as African in the same way settlers of the 13 colonies thought of themselves as American. These settlers referred to themselves as Afrikaners, that's with a K, and spoke a language called Afrikaans. The problem is that these white Afrikaners, who speak like Dutch, are not going to be friendly with the British. In fact, the Afrikaners are going to fight the British. Why? Well, the British really want to take control of the Afrikaners. They do rule the Afrikaners, and the Afrikaners say, look, we're out of here. We're not going to let the British take us over. And so on the handout it says the Great Trek. A trek is like a voyage, and all the white Afrikaners say, we're going to move away from the coast. We're going to move inland. We're going to trek to the inland to get away from the British. And the settlers on the handout were seeking to escape the British, and that's why it's called a trek. They were moving inland to escape the British. And the British, why are they trying to run away? Why are they trying to get away from British rule? Well, on the handout, they were trying to escape the British. The British were anti-slavery, while the Boers, and that word Boers is another word for Afrikaners, so you can call the Afrikaners, or you can call them the Boers. The Boers were pro-slavery, so these men owned slaves. They didn't see it was a big problem. These are the people that are going to later on, when South Africa becomes independent, will lead like apartheid, where you'll have South Africa being a white minority ruling the black majority. They didn't see it was a problem, and so there was actually a lot of racism among the Boers, and they were willing to fight. On the handout, it says the British wanted to prevent the Boer expansion to South Africa. The British didn't want these guys to go more into South Africa. They wanted to prevent conflict with the natives. So just like when the British ruled the United States, they told the United States, hey, don't move past the proclamation line because you'll just fight a bunch of Indians. We have to pick up the pieces. They told these Afrikaners, we don't want you to spread because if you do, you're just going to fight local black Africans, and then we have to go in and stop all the fighting. Well, the Afrikaners don't want to listen, and they fight a rebellion called the Boer War. This is a conflict between the Boers, or the Afrikaners, and the British. Ultimately, it would be costly in lives and money, but the British would keep their possession, control it. This is a super sad picture of a young boy. This is an Afrikaner, and the British, one of the strategies that they used was early concentration camps. And so they would do this and use incredible measures, and they were able to control this territory, even if it meant doing things like this to fellow white European settlers. The British do keep the Afrikaners from rebellion. So in this chapter, we've seen two failed rebellions. The Sepoy Rebellion, Indians wanting their freedom and fighting the British, fail. The British hold on to India. Here, white European settlers called the Afrikaners rebel against the British. They want the freedom to own slaves. They fail. The British have control of India. The British have control of South Africa. The British are a power on the rise. They're also a power that is influencing another part of the world. A third part of the world the British are taking over is Australia. On the handout, Australia and New Zealand. This is the next section that we're going to be talking about. It says where we have Australia and New Zealand. James Cook had discovered New Zealand and Australia in 1769. We say discovered in quotes because if there's people that live there already, you didn't discover it. You might remember the people who originally lived in Australia were called the Aborigines. And on the handout, it was originally a penal colony. That word penal colony means a prison colony. The local native people that lived there were called the Aborigines. There was probably about 650,000 Aborigines, but by the time the British took over, it goes down to 93,000. And the reason for that is the same ideas. It's diseases that they didn't have any exposure or protection from. Here are some Aborigines. These are the local people that live there. Aborigine man. So these are the people that live there, but they didn't have any protection. They didn't have guns. They didn't have germs. They didn't have steel. So the British devastate the population, not necessarily on purpose, but it does work out for the British that no matter how hard the Aborigines fight, no matter how hard that they resist, that they will not be able to keep their independence. But that's not the only area. The British also take over New Zealand. New Zealand is right off here. Many of you know a little bit about New Zealand. It's been real famously used in movies recently. Here's New Zealand. The site of the filming of Lord of the Rings was all in New Zealand. Beautiful country, but it was inhabited by a native people called the Maoris on the handout. Here's pictures of Maori women. Here are Maori warriors. And the Maoris went from about 250,000 to 42,000, and the same thing happened here. You know, these people were people that had their freedom, but because of disease and other things, they were reduced. Gold was discovered, so they said, hey, forget this being a prison colony. Forget prisoners. We don't want to waste a colony that has gold on prisoners, so they said, forget prisoners, and 1 million free settlers came by 1860. 1 million free settlers came by 1860. They didn't want to waste a perfectly good continent filled with gold that had been discovered on prisoners, so 1 million settlers came in 1860. Political rule was modeled after Canada. I'll explain what I mean by that. They wanted to prevent an independence movement, so they granted them a high degree of self-rule. So this is Australia's money today. Australia's money still has, if you look at it, the Queen of England. So even though they are a free independent nation, today the Queen of England, oddly, is technically the Queen of Australia, even though Australia is its own independent nation. If you go to Canada, on Canada's money, they have the Queen of England. The Queen of England is technically the Queen of Australia, even though it's an independent nation. It's a weird thing. And the British say, we don't want to repeat the whole 13 colony deal. We'll just give them a lot of freedom. As long as they still say we're in charge, as long as they still recognize us, then we're cool. So they're given a high degree of self-rule. In 1897, the Aborigines are forced into reservations. They say, look, we're going to take your continent away from you. And that's a bummer for them. New labor migrations, and we're done. The result of abolition, remember, abolition is getting rid of slavery, the necessity of a working class. Well, now that I don't have slaves to work on plantations, well, I need to replace them with someone. The necessity of a working class, there was a need for thousands of Indians and Chinese throughout the Caribbean and other British colonies. With new job opportunities, the Caribbean gets filled up with people from India, filled up with workers from China who move seeking a new opportunity. The Caribbean, we see 500,000 Indians from India moving to the Caribbean, and Hawaii even has an influx of Japanese looking for jobs. So, in summary, the Europeans are on the move. They're conquering parts of the world they've never conquered. Africa being conquered for the first time, dominated in Egypt by the British, Algeria dominated by the British, West Africa dominated by the British, South Africa dominated by the British, Australia, New Zealand dominated by the British, India dominated by the British. Rebellions like the Sepoy Rebellion, rebellions like the Boer War fail. If you're going to pick one country on the rise, it's going to be the British. They will be the sole superpower and the ones calling the shots in the 1800s.